Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this session. We are going to be talking about unlocking solutions through transformational science. Please move to the front if you want to get involved in the session. We have time for Q&A towards the end, and welcome you to fill the seats. I'd like to welcome the panel that we have here today. On stage, we have, first of all, I'm Wendy Broadgate. I'm the Global Hub Director of Future Earth, the global research network on sustainability science. And I'd like to welcome our panelists that come from the science community, the publishing community, observations, and we have representation from the business community as well. So this is going to be a dialogue about transformational science and the challenges of connecting with policy and practice. So I'd like to welcome, first of all, Yuri Rogel, who is Director of Research at the Grantham Institute and Professor of Climate Science and Policy. Welcome. Sandrine Dixon-Leclerc, who is the co-president of the Club of Rome. And then Fred Fenner from Frontiers Research Publications. Lars Peter Rishogård from WMO, who's Director of the Global Greenhouse Gas Watch. And last but not least, Claire Kesker-Cook, Director of Policy and Advocacy and Member Mobilization at the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. So welcome to the panel. We also have online Paul Behrens, who is an Associate Professor at Leiden University. Welcome, Paul. You are far away from me, so you're going to have to...
It's also behind
exactly.
your back.
But I see you, but not very well, so please wave but the participants in the audience see you well, Paul. But please signal to me if you want to lean in. So thank you for joining us. And I'd like to start first thinking about what is this transformational science that we're talking about? And pose the question to Fred. You know, what is transformational science, and how do you define it? But also, what do you see the role of publishers in this world of science to policy?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Wendy. I think everybody here will have their own definition of what transformational science is. I personally like to think of it as new science with a real potential, a capacity to shift paradigms, and new science that can really drive change towards improving the societal challenges that we face. So I think I'll just leave it as simple as that for now, and probably other people here will also have points to add about what they think transformational science is. As a publisher, it's extremely important that we work with this transformational science in a special way. First of all, it is our responsibility to make it open. We had a session this morning, a very interesting session this morning about open science, and my colleague Henry Markram pointed out that the importance of getting this new science immediately into the collective scientific brain is really it's a metaphor to show that that's how the brain is going to work correctly. That's how we're going to have a healthy brain. We have to get all the neurons firing, and it's the open dynamic that allows that to happen. It's the open dynamic that is going to allow us to take this work and get it into the research innovation cycle. And we heard about artificial intelligence. That's going to be a growing additional pressure in terms of the urgency of getting these insights into the research innovation cycle. It has to participate in policy. We hear that all the time. The urgency of the climate emergency compels us to prepare these insights in a way that's useful in policy. And we have to restore the public's faith and trust in science. And all of these are important elements of the open science dynamic. Henry mentioned this morning about what happened with COVID. We keep on coming back to COVID as a prototypical emergency. We all know, Henry pointed out, 60% of all publications are currently behind a paywall. But when the COVID emergency struck, everybody pulled together around the Allen Institute, where they created the COVID-19 database. and all publishers participated. All of the relevant papers were freed as open content in the context of this project. And the project was hugely successful. There is no doubt that this dynamic saved many, many lives. And what we need to do is take the same sense of urgency into the climate, the global warming emergency. This morning at the session, Maria Espinosa talked about the need to translate the implications of research. And this is also something that's a responsibility of a publisher. Around the articles that we publish in transformational science, you have to provide policy editorials. You have to add voices of leading scientists to put the work into perspective. You have to provide layperson summaries. And what we do also at Frontiers is we provide articles that explain the science to children and their families. And this is all about translating these important implications to the full demographic of society. I'll point out one example. Yuri and his colleagues at the Grantham Institute recently published an article in Frontiers in Science on the zero emission commitment. And this is all about how will the Earth systems respond to the atmospheric CO2 load once we get to net zero. And there was an article in their editorial by Michael Mann who said it very, very eloquently. The warming will stop when the pollution stops. And I think this is the kind of communication of the essentials of the articles that are extremely important. But the other thing that we need to do is we need to showcase the people that are behind the work. We have to put the scientists on a stage and really have them recognized as the heroes of society. We have to build trust in this community, and we have to create a dialogue between the scientific community and all the other stakeholders. We run a forum program. We have events that go out that run throughout the year, and we put thought leaders together with scientists, and we work hard to create that dialogue. And one last thing I'd like to mention at Frontiers is that we also run an annual Frontiers Planet Prize, the Frontiers Foundation, and this is all also about accelerating awareness around Earth system science. It's about creating an international network of institutions, of academies of science that support this work, to support the urgency of this climate research. The way it works is we have a jury of 100 Earth system scientists presided by Johan Rockström, that in a very objective way picks the most important work that's being proposed by this international network. So in summary, and I'll just point out that Paul Berens was the recipient of the first round of the Frontiers Planet Prize earlier this year. Most importantly, what we need to do is we have to publish this transformational science, but we have to amplify the message in all these ways in order to make sure that we can participate in pushing the needle and making a difference.
Great. Thank you, Fred. And congratulations, Paul, on receiving the Frontiers Planet Prize. So what are these critical paradigm shifts or system changes that Paul's referring to? We have some key scientists on the panel here, and I'll turn first to Yuri and ask you, could we have a microphone, please?
I have one here.
Great. Can we have another microphone? There's another one.
Thank you.
Great. So Yuri, what are the key challenges what are the key system changes that we need, and what are the challenges when you're talking about getting science into policy?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for organizing this amazing panel. I mean, thinking about the system changes that we need, and looking at this panel, we already can anticipate some of the messages coming out. So I want to take one step back and how science can actually inform the necessity of making those system changes. If we ask the world to go through this incredible, challenging but positive transition between winners and losers, we want to be quite sure that this is exactly what we would like to be pursuing or what needs to be done. And in that sense, I want to come back to one of the motivations under the underlying the paper that we also wrote with Frontiers on the zero emission commitment. And basically what that paper helps us to tell is what is the key geophysical milestone that we need to hit to limit warming or to stop warming from increasing further. And there, in our paper, we looked at what we know about what the climate will do once we hit net zero emissions. And what we find, or what we also assessed in detail, was that we know that the climate won't be stable, but it will be stabilizing. And let me maybe explain what that means. When we reach net zero emissions, we know, or we understand that global warming will roughly stop. We know global warming won't become much worse. And that is because we understand that CO2 concentrations will slowly go down. We understand that heat uptake will slowly kind of balance that kind of evolution. And so we also understand that achieving net zero CO2 emissions is a key milestone in our trajectory to dealing with this challenge. We also know that a world with stable warming doesn't mean a stable climate. Many aspects in that world will continue to change for centuries and millennia, and that is also something that where science can put a finger on it. Our challenge won't stop at the time that we reach net zero emissions. Glaciers will continue to melt, sea level rise will continue to exacerbate for many centuries, and so will ecosystems who only slowly adapt to the new conditions, or maybe only slowly decline after a certain warming level is reached. And besides that, I would also highlight that when we think about what we can achieve in terms of emission reductions, the science also clearly shows that while net zero CO2 emissions is a really important milestone in our trajectory to achieve a safe future, it might really just be that, a milestone that we need to hit, but then where we move past and after which we go to a world where we start slowly but surely start to reverse in a sustainable way what we are currently impacting on our planet. Thank you.
Thank you. The very serious challenges that are facing us, particularly at this COP. How do we set goals to decarbonize and hit net zero, and what are the consequences? So the food transition is another area of systems change, and I'm going to turn to you, Paul, and ask you to speak a bit about the transformations we need there, and also the challenges. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks a lot, Wendy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. We hear you well.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful. Great to be able to be speaking with you today. Yeah, you already mentioned what needs to be done. And, the good thing is that we know pretty much almost all the technical and economic ways to achieve these transitions. Unfortunately, we're much hazier on the social barriers to implementing those changes. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But you mentioned the food transition. We're quite clear about what's happened there. We also are quite clear about what's happened in the energy system. The energy system is mostly the scientific consensus. Modelling studies using multiple modelling approaches show that it is mostly wind and solar with batteries, electrifying our energy use, with some technologies taking a smaller role, underground heat storage systems, small amount of hydrogen, perhaps nuclear, but the bulk is wind and solar. That's clear from pretty much every modelling study. In the food system on its own is enough to drive us beyond 1.5 or even 2 degrees. So food system researchers are talking about a great food transformation. And this is based on plant-based diets, reductions in food waste, and improvements in production. But the big paradigm shift, the huge shift that we really need, the one that we can't get away with in terms of the scientific consensus, again, using multiple modelling approaches, multiple modelling studies, is plant-based diets, especially in high-income nations. That's where the biggest opportunity lies, and how we basically can't get around it. Now, this would not only drive rapid reductions in emissions, but also open large areas of land. And our work suggests that if you are able to return the land saved from a shift to plant-rich diets in high-income nations, so plant-rich, not completely plant-based, but plant-rich, we'd save an area the size of the EU. And then if we were to return that to nature, we would double the benefits from the emissions of the system alone. And then the joined up thinking, the paradigm shift really comes when you think about what that means for better health, for numerous national parks, the nature that could surround us all, and multiple large-scale studies showing that this is better for people's health. Not to mention the lower chance of pandemics, antimicrobial resistance, cleaner water, cleaner air, better soils, etc. So, these are huge paradigm shifts, these two big paradigm shifts. And so then the question becomes, what's needed to make these paradigm shifts a reality? And I think, firstly, resistance from vested interests, be they corporate or governmental, they're consistent and they're coordinated in a campaign to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the winners and losers, as Yuri just mentioned, to make the number of winners seen as small as possible, and the number of losers seem as big as possible and as important as possible, and to try and downplay any way in which we can ease that transition to help compensate the losers from the transition. And we've seen this for years in the energy transition, but now it's really starting to accelerate in the food transition as well. So, while scientists are in the room from the perspective of temperature targets, generally less in the room when it comes to the solutions to the scientific consensus. Secondly, I think, we know a lot about the technical challenges and what technically needs to be done, but we know much less about the social change. We don't have good modelling understandings of leverages for tipping points, and perhaps we won't ever, because it's such a complicated picture. Committed minorities can shift the majority to new forms. And lastly, just to mention, we don't know a lot about how climate impacts, like extreme weather events and increasing food insecurity, will feed back onto society, both in terms of the politics, but also on the mitigation and the adaptation efforts. And this is a really complicated feedback, and we often don't even try to assess this. And the SSPs, which are used as storylines for the future, don't even include these functions of climate damage in the storylines. But we can see that many of the mitigation options and the adaptation options will obviously increase resilience to climatic changes. So I'll leave it there. That's the sort of two paradigm shifts that I really see, and three of the major things standing in the way.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul. That's a really nice bridge to the challenges, from identifying the shifts we need to what are the challenges to implementing these paradigm shifts in policy and practice. And I'm turning to Sandrine now, because you've worked a lot in a number of these systemic change areas. What do you see as the challenges for implementation, in policy and practice?
Thank you for that question. And yeah, I mean, I've spent 35 years of my career now looking at how I can build bridges between the science, policy, and then implementation. And having worked and written many, many different types of directives at the European level, and looking at the types of science that we need, there were two key issues. I think that often the issues that we see is how do we truly understand the science and get the science we need for the policy decisions at the right time. So there is a problem in terms of the timing. Many policy leaders are trying to make decisions, and yet they don't have the science that they need for those decisions. So what do? They tend to get lobbied then by businesses who actually want to stall those special interest groups that were actually just brought up. And that is a real issue, so that's a barrier. The second key barrier is how do we then translate the complexity of the science and the impacts from a systemic perspective into a simplified policy proposal? And that is also a really big problem. We hear continuously from companies, from governance, that we actually need to simplify. But this is very complex. Within that complexity comes from the fact that typically we are only looking at the hard sciences, so the absolute effects, if we look at climate change, for example, without bringing in the social sciences. And that is typically where the pain points are. So if we look at social tipping points today, energy poverty, for example, if we had thought about ways in which we can enhance access to energy across Europe at an affordable price, knowing full well that we actually even have the science demonstrating what we need to do, we could have gone much faster. But what we did was we started pushing in certain directions without even thinking about the impact on people. So I want to bring, however, one other key disconnect, and that is we are here at the COP at a place where actually the science of today has not been injected into the decision-making that we're needing to do right now. We're still basing ourselves on some IPCC reports that have actually, to be frank, already been bypassed with the 2-degree passing that we saw last Friday. So what myself and Johan Rockström, who was mentioned, as well as part of Frontiers, have been doing, and we've been asking, how can we reform the COP so we bring science back in? So we ensure that we actually have the conversations we need with scientists live so we can make the decisions, but also put the pressure that's necessary on the ambition. And that right there is a huge barrier, because science is not part of the discussions in the way in which it should be. So maybe I'll leave it at that for the moment, Wendy, and then we can come back.
Yeah, thanks, Sandrine. And that I, fully agree with this. Both having scientists, natural scientists at the table, but also having social science and social scientists at the table is really critical. So that timing loop is connected up. Lars Peter, do you have you've had a long experience working at the science policy interface, thinking about the challenges of getting science into policy? Would you like to share some of your experiences there?
I'd love to. This is why I'm here. No, I resonate very much with what Sandrine was just saying. So we're talking about open science. Science is actually largely open. I know that there are problems that we were talking about this morning also. A lot of science is behind the paywall, etc. But there are ways to get around that when we really agree that we want to. And COVID was a very good example of that. Science became open all of a sudden because governments actually wanted that to happen. So one way to maybe paraphrase what Sandrine was saying is that science may be open, but it is not necessarily received with open arms. It is certainly not received with open arms here. That has been my experience. I am here mostly to follow the negotiations, and I can tell you that it can be a bear to get inserted in COP decision language, even in substance conclusion. In substance conclusions, things that are unequivocally and uncontestably true because they do not align with what parties want to see in the text. The same is true for IPCC reports, actually. They may be a bit outdated sometimes. They have to be because they have to go through a very extensive review cycle. But they are also vetted by policymakers before they are published. So it is not really, I don't want to discredit the IPCC because it is a fantastic success in some way, but it is not completely pure science. So what do we need to do? We need to build trust, and we need to work together. I think Fred mentioned that we need to build trust. I would caution against oversimplifying. This is actually not how you build trust. This system is immensely complicated. And it is complicated long before you bring social science into it. It is complicated already from a hard science point of view. We like to think that if we can dial back the emissions, we can stabilize the climate. The Earth's history doesn't really work that way. When you look at the climate records, climate has rarely ever been stable. The entire human history, if we count that for about 3,000 years, is a bit of an anomaly. Climate has been remarkably stable in those 3,000 years. We are moving out of that stability regime now into something that is probably more typical of the Earth's climate history, which has tended to be very turbulent. And I think we are doing ourselves and we are doing politicians and policymakers a disservice if we tell them, okay, you need to dial back, you need to get to net zero in 2040, and then you need to take out, I don't know what the number will be, 40 or 50 gigatons of CO2, and then everything will be fine. It probably will not work that way. The system is too complicated. And Sandrine, you mentioned the social, the feedbacks that come from social science, but even from the hard sciences point of view, just the physical system, we do not know exactly what will happen. And I think we need to acknowledge that and not in frustration with the lack of action from policymakers, start shouting simplified messages and saying, okay, we are all going to stop eating meat and we're going to stop flying, otherwise we're all going to hell. Because that will not work. We've already tried that. So this problem is an emergency on par with COVID, but it's a slower burning emergency. But I think we will need to come to grips with the fact that it can only be solved by letting scientists and policymakers and ultimately politicians work together. And I'm not seeing that at the COP right now. I'm seeing very few scientists here. One of my fellow panelists this morning estimated that it's about 0.5% of the attendees here. And their message, at least based on my personal experience, is not really being heard. So something needs to change. And on that happy note, I'll stop.
Yeah, thanks, Lars-Peter. And actually, you know, not having a policy person on this panel when we're here at the COP is, you know, it's a real missed opportunity, because here we do have scientists.
And not having more people in the room, because this is important, and yet, I mean, you're all incredibly important, and we're very happy that you're here, but it's crazy we haven't filled out this room. It needs to be full.
There's an awful lot happening here in the fringes of the intergovernmental negotiations, and ultimately we actually need to be more at the table. Exactly. So I'd like to bring Claire into the conversation. Obviously we have scientists here, and we have business representation here, Claire. So, you know, how can the private sector be brought into the conversation? How can they play a role in helping raise ambition and help accelerate systems change?
Thank you for having me here. I'll speak loud because it is quite loud. There's really good coffee in the other room. Very briefly, just to also give some context on why I'm here and who WBCSD is. I lead all our partnerships work. WBCSD is a non-profit business organization, and we represent over 200 companies in the sustainability space around climate, nature, equity agenda. I have quite some private sector experience. I used to work at a large multinational for over 12 years before WBCSD and after my graduate studies. So I do bring quite some different context into this that can be useful. I prepared speaking notes, and I will briefly share, but just I wanted to build on what's being discussed because it's actually more interesting. And one is, I love the example from COVID-19. It's used a lot. What we haven't mentioned yet, and what really accelerated action, and where you had academia, private sector, governments working together, was that there were some very clear incentives put in place that drove extremely fast moving. And yes, that can be about profit, but it can also be about solving a problem right there that's burning. Literally, people saw the impact. But we have not mentioned the role of frameworks and incentives in this discussion. I think that needs to be addressed because it's almost something that's kind of this hidden thing, but it's very clear about what happened in the pandemic. And I think with regards to the climate crisis, it's not always that clear on that sense. Now, what can the private sector do? We are really looking at the how-to solutions. So instead of just saying, okay, situation is bad, business needs to take action, etc., it's also, okay, situation is bad, but what can we do? So what we do is we try to work together with our member companies as well as others, which is the role of public-private collaboration. I've led science to policy dialogues because I really believe in bringing scientists together with policymakers. And yes, I wish we had policymakers here as well as business and having conversations. So that's something that we absolutely do. But we develop these solutions. For example, in our partnership for accelerated carbon transparency, in short PACT, we love abbreviations. We've created a framework. We aim to build a global standard in a way around exchange of Scope 3 emissions that allows companies to compare information around Scope 3. Just to make life easier, create more alignment. We discussed frameworks earlier, and just make the operating space easier. In the climate drive, we've created a toolbox of case studies, examples, for companies to start taking climate action. Can be very basic, but how can they do it? Especially how can companies in the global south do it that might not always have access to the information or the capacity or the resources? So sharing those case studies, very practical examples. And then I wanted to use one example from nature, because we see nature and the climate agenda much more interrelated, not just here, but for example, we are working on building roadmaps to nature positive, to also help companies prepare for what's coming with TNFD. So it's about aligning all the space on the global level, but increasingly also regionally and nationally, and working with the companies as well as others to really create those how-to solutions. And that's a very practical way for companies to get involved, show action, because there's so much interest, so much excitement, but we just need to focus and implement.
Great, great. Thanks. So, I mean, you've put on the table a lot of things that businesses can do, and you pointed to incentives being really clear. A question more generally, are governments doing enough, and what more can governments do? Sandrine, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think there are a few issues, and if you look at this roadmap, and all of us now have been looking at climate and nature, and in fact, again, with Johan, we published our planetary emergency plan, which brought in the human dimension as well. So the complexity of the feedback loops between biodiversity, between climate, and then bringing in the human dimension. And here's what we saw. First, we know very well that our governments are siloed. Ministries are siloed. Hence, when they look at science, when they look at data points, when they look at solutions, they're siloed. One of the ways that we need to move forward as scientists, economists, and business leaders is to break down those silos. So the first key point has been to ensure that we work with governments, and when we do, to start to bridge the gap between those different silos and have joined up thinking. That also means that you need different types of scientists. You need to have scientists that are also looking at the interconnectedness, whether it be through system dynamic modeling, which we at the Club of Rome do, and other modelers, but also ensuring that those who don't, you bring them in for the right conversations, because they're not having those discussions. And so this is the other point that I wanted to bring in. The solidarity of COVID was remarkable for a variety of reasons. And Clea is absolutely right. One is the incentives were clear. But also, there was this joint desire beyond the fiscal incentives and trying to ensure that we eradicate COVID, the joint desire of communicating, knowledge exchange, working together, and making all of it open, whether it be non-proprietary for actually countries, but also between countries. And that was fundamental. And I think the other point which we forget, and this is coming to the great opening on transformation, transformational science was not the only thing we saw during COVID. It was transformational systems governance. And that was important, because what it did was it forced leaders to talk to each other, to work together, to break down those silos in order to transform. And we did see the greatest transformation we've ever seen. So I'll end with this point. For me, the incredible aha moment of COVID, as painful as it was we can transform. We're being told that decarbonization is too difficult on so many levels, but when push comes to shove, we can totally change our economic models, our financial models, our science, and our inputs in order to move forward faster, in order to meet the joint goals that we actually have.
Thank you, Sandrine. That's absolutely true. And why are we not getting a COVID-type response for this planetary emergency? We really have it. We've already heard that we don't have enough scientists here at the climate change COP in with the negotiators. What else can we do as a science community to really raise the level of communication around this planetary emergency, but also that we do have solutions and transformative science for ways forward? Yuri, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. And this is an incredibly interesting conversation and discussion. I mean, I absolutely agree that science needs to be more central in decision making. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely convinced that more scientists is going to solve the problem. Because put 3 scientists in a room and you get 6 opinions, and some of them might be really fringe, some of them might be very novel, but to solve this problem, to solve this global problem, we need robust insights that can withstand the time, and that also, and that's where the social science can also learn, or physical scientists can also learn something from the social scientists. Even a scientist is a human, so that person comes to the table with biases, with opinions, with ingrained beliefs, and so what we need to do is indeed a process that can extract that kind of knowledge and bring it to the table. And I know we're all very critical of the IPCC, but ultimately the IPCC is a process that tries to achieve that tries to achieve clarity in this kind of buzz of scientific evidence and scientific novelty, and bringing it back to the conversation where the conversation started, where what kind of transformational science does the world need? I think methods and way in which the vast body of knowledge in all these disciplines that we are looking at, from the physical science is actually quite good already at trying to pull these things together, but together with the social sciences, food system, water systems, social sciences, how can we extract actionable evidence and actionable insights from that piece of knowledge? And I think that is an incredible challenge. We are only just scratching at the surface there. In another context, I had to look at the existing literature, scientific literature that mentions climate change. Nowadays, between 75 and 100,000 papers a year on the topic climate change, and not just climate change, that not even food or all the other things, are being published. It becomes humanly impossible to understand what we know just by trying to read those papers. And there we really need to get transformational methods to extract those insights. Let me then also conclude on the one part where what these methods needs to be. These methods also need to be trusted. We don't want to have one big science mixer where we put lots of papers in there and then a nice, shiny insight comes out of it. Policymakers also vis-à-vis their the people they represent need to be trusted, need to trust those insights to be indeed results. And that is a huge challenge, and I think we will be working on that for the years to come. That doesn't mean that we don't know today what we need to do and which steps we can take in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, thank you. But I could say from a scientific point of view, as a global research network at Future Earth, we're really working on systems change, integration, and bringing together scientists from all over the world to distill their science in ways that can be communicated with policy in a credible way, because it's more of a consensus than an individual piece of work. But yes, we need much more of this, and we need radical collaboration around elevating those messages.
I think Paul was saying something.
Paul, I'm going to turn to you now.
Could I just add to that point? I mean, if you talk to science communication experts, over and over again, they say, the importance is repetition and messages that convey the consensus. And when you look at both those things, scientists don't like to do it. So scientists don't like to engage in repetition because they find it boring. We're all sort of interested in finding sort of new things to say about the edges. We get stuck on the small differences, on the things that we don't agree with. And we don't continue to repeat in many different audiences the things that we know, the consensus in the different fields about the solutions of what needs to happen. So I think, it is really, it's putting a lot of responsibility on the scientists. I don't think it should necessarily be scientists just doing this alone, but I do think it's very important to learn about what works from a communications perspective. And as much as we don't like to see it, repetition and simpler messages about what the consensus looks like works. And I think we just need to keep that in mind, that the first time we're completely sick of saying something is the first time that somebody else is hearing it. So we just need to keep repeating these messages.
Thanks, Paul. That's a really, really good point. So I wonder if Lars Peter wants to come in more on this issue.
Yeah, about a couple of things actually. Certainly about the scientific process. Yuri is obviously right that if you get a bunch of scientists in and have an unstructured conversation with them, they will voice different opinions about different topics. And the IPCC process is indeed a structured way to bring information to the table. But if you, like me, if you sat through SAPSTA last year and heard them discuss for a week whether they take note of the report, whether they take note with the appreciation or they welcome the report, then you would probably agree that that's not the problem. The problem is that policymakers don't want it because it's saying things that they don't want to hear. And where the analogy with COVID breaks down to me is the urgency of it. A pandemic is immediately relatable, and you could see day by day how this was spreading. Climate change, yeah, maybe it'll be bad for some subsistence farmers in a country on the other side of the planet. Maybe it won't be so bad for me, or maybe it won't happen in my lifetime. It is not immediately relatable at the same time, and I think this is part of why we're not taking action on it. We talk about the climate emergency, but it is not being experienced and it is not being treated as an emergency quite the same way. When you were asking, are governments doing enough? And I want to get back to what Claire was saying. Businesses are doing a lot of things, and they have immense innovation potential, and they can move very, very quickly. But if you don't define the rules under which they move, they will do what businesses do very well. They will find ways to make money of it, because that is what defines the private sector. There's nothing wrong with that. This is their role in society. And my sense of the discussions around the COP and the Paris Agreement is that to some extent governments have abdicated their responsibility and have kicked it over to the private sector and say, okay, we can't figure out how to do this. Could you please take care of this? Without actually telling them why. Claire and I were having a conversation just as we were getting ready to go in here, and there were a couple of things we agreed on. The private sector needs predictability, and they need equal rules for all to play under, and then they can innovate in pretty much whatever direction we like to see. Governments have not defined that in the climate change space, and I think we are really missing that.
Claire.
Larson, so I'll just build on your points. And it was fun. We just really had a 2-minute conversation outside. And it's good to see how this thinking is coming together and builds to something I had written down as we were preparing for this panel. And it's around what can business do more to accelerate things and also maybe to drive some government action in that sense. And help those that do the right thing win. Let's put it like that, and do well. And one of the things that we're seeing increasingly is the misalignment with financial markets, because it's also it's again links to incentives and the way companies are rewarded for, let's call it, for sustainability performance. So one of the things that we're doing and are launching at this year's COP is the CEO Guide on climate-related corporate performance and accountability system, to basically help create more of a link between the financial system and business innovation. So help companies create a very simple framework on how to measure, be accountable and be held accountable for carbon performance, to start paving the way to show to governments how it could potentially be done in partnership with business, so that it doesn't become a you're against us or something like that, but really how can we collaborate? What kind of frameworks can we build together that companies are supportive of working with governments? And that's where science is coming in. And that's what I'm going to take away as a key input from this discussion, that whatever work we do, and we've done it on lots of things, engage with scientists and so on, but again, everybody's busy, we have limited time, resources, all this, that this is something that we need to do more of. We do synthesis reports, we read the IPCC synthesis report, we write a business summary on it, everything, but what we need to do more of, as a key takeaway that I take from my work, is when we identify these ideas, frameworks, build solutions, create tools, let's talk more to the scientific community about what we are doing, get in some of the latest insight, but possibly also use our work and share it. So key thing for action.
That's music to our ears from the science community. Thank you, Claire. But I realize that we're actually running out of time now. I think this has been a really, really dynamic discussion. Fantastic. But we have a chance for a last round of comments, some wrap-up comments, responses to what you've heard, or some new inputs. So I'm going to start with you, Paul. Would you like to make some closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a fantastic session. Thank you for all of the really amazing points being made. Perhaps I just want to reflect just finally on that point about business and government. I think we do also need to understand that there is a large amount of capture of policymaking and government for corporate interests and for other vested interests. So it does go both ways. You know, yes, the policymakers aren't going fast enough. Yes, they're showing no leadership. But when we see that, often, it is these lobbying efforts that go into that, and this is scientifically documented. I mean, I'm talking outside of my area of expertise, but this is work that's been documented in Science and Nature in multiple papers, multiple articles through the years. So I think I think we need to understand that there's a dynamic there. And then the cracking through that dynamic is a really large systems problem, as Cedrine was saying. So I just want to maybe say that's something that we need to keep our mind open to, and that we should be supporting any sort of group that is looking to inject more science into the policy domain, such that we can try to rebalance some of the framing and some of the messages that policymakers are hearing.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Who would like to go next? We've got about a minute each.
Yeah, so just to follow up on the word inject that Paul just used, I think, to take the discussion back to transformational science, I think that, the key words I've been jotting down are things like coordinate, cooperate, framework, and silos, and urgency. So what I'm thinking is that, do we need to think about the vocabulary, how the language that we use when we go from a scientific domain into these other frameworks or these other silos? I think that's. I would really also like to hear from other people how much of that. I'm getting the sense that is a very, very important, critical part of actually making progress here. So that's the comment I'd like to finish on.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. Please go ahead.
Yes, two brief points. One is based on what you said, Paul, and I completely agree. There are multiple interests at play from multiple stakeholders, not just business. Completely agree. What a key role there is transparency. And I know it's complicated and maybe not, but transparency and linked to that accountability is key. Both individual accountability, but ultimately also in frameworks that lead to greater accountability. And on the other side, I just wanted to very briefly also applaud the scientific community, because I have a bit of a feeling that there is and I'm not so usually participating in these discussions, that the mood is a bit pessimistic. There isn't enough scientific engagement. There's so much happening outside of COP, where the scientific community is very clearly listened to and also engaging with. And one of the best examples, just as kudos to that, is both my children go to a small public school in Switzerland, and I also have friends in Greece and in Germany and so on. The amount of awareness that already small children are having about climate change, the way the educational systems have adapted quite fast, the way kids are learning to think about it and also take action. My daughter, and she's 9, comes home and explains to me complicated topics, and I work in this space, and she's starting to think about things and take action and ask questions about COP. So this is not because of TV. We're very strict on screen time. This is because of the schools. So I just wanted to say there's a lot happening, and congratulations to the scientific community for that, because I think it comes from there.
Great, right. Jerry, would you like to go next?
Maybe picking up on that and what the scientific community has achieved and where we are today, I think it's really great to see the body of knowledge that we have accumulated. Just repeating my point from before, I think we really need to work on translating that into actionable insights that can be taken up by policymakers. But then also my final point is we also really need to think about messengers that take that knowledge and bring it to the policy table. And those messengers must be trusted, but are not necessarily scientists, or scientists with a very specific skill in messaging. And I think that is something maybe that kind of group and that kind of collaboration is something that can also pull the science more into the center of the political debate on climate change and climate solutions.
Thank you. Would you like to go next, Lars-Peter?
Yeah, no, it's been absolutely fascinating to listen to this. We have different views on what scientists can and cannot do and the level of maturity of science. But one thing that comes out of this very clearly to me is that this really, really needs to be a collaborative exercise in order for it to work. Scientists are not here partly because they're not listened to and partly because they don't want to be here. And those two things are closely interlinked. Business is here and they're not here, and we can point fingers either at governments or at business lobbying interest, and both of them are to some extent fair game. But we really need a new type of framework for business and science and governments and policymakers to work together. Otherwise, we will be running around in circles and keep pointing fingers at each other. And this is, I don't have a very long history with the COP, but I have a very lengthy history by now as an earth scientist and a shorter history as a UN bureaucrat. But what I have seen in the 3 COPs I've been at is a very substantial level of mistrust between these different entities, and that is not helpful.
Thank you. Go ahead, Sandrine.
Yeah, so I guess before we all leave this room, I think I want to be very clear about a few things. As an environmental scientist and feeling that evidence, knowledge, and science is the framework for everything that we actually should do in a purpose-driven world, I want to build on the transformational science push and say we will not transform if it's only about the science. And I think we've all agreed on that. With transformational science, we need transformational policy, transformational innovations, which will, with them, bring transformational governance, because we are in the midst of a geoengineering war that could break without any governance. We're seeing right now, confronted with AI, that as transformational as AI could be if it was purpose-driven, it could also be a complete and utter disaster. So within our scientific frameworks, if transformational science is going to enable us to transform, we have to think about all of those elements going alongside. And that also brings me to the communications element that was so important. The IPCC did not start to communicate by itself. It received a huge amount of funding from the European Climate Foundation to enable it to communicate with communicators. Because scientists do have a communication problem, especially those of us who have an engineering degree as well. Narrative building and transformational partnerships has to go hand in hand within the transformational sciences. And then the last point, which has also been brought up, which is that as much as we try to transform and bring in transformational sciences, if we don't think about the systems breakdown that we have right now across our economic system, our over-financialized economic system, which means that the financial architecture is shareholder value, profit first, whereas we, through the sciences, are trying to actually shift towards a purpose-driven world. A total contradiction with those vested interests that are only actually looking at profit. So that brings me to the last point. The scientific assessments that we have done through our system dynamic model has shown us that we can only reach our planetary boundaries at the speed and scale that we need if we take into consideration inequality and poverty first. And so that is about, once again, the social elements that must be taken into account. All of those elements are going to enable us to transform, but they have to go hand in glove together.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Sandrine, and thank you all for a very interesting conversation. And thank you to the audience for bearing with us. This has been a pleasure to moderate, and I'd like to give you a round of applause for this.